The first time she stepped out onto the lake, folks swore they could hear the ice groan. It wasn't just the sound of pressure cracking through a frozen sheet of water. It was the sound of every settler's judgment weighing down on her. That widow, that foreigner, that fool who dared to plant her home not on solid ground like any Christian with sense, but on a flat expanse of blue-white ice that wouldn't last come spring. Her name was Alissa Denholm, 32 years old, with a baby tied to her chest and a hammer in her fist. Her husband had died the year before in a logging accident upriver, crushed beneath a trunk that slipped during a thaw. Since then, she hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to any neighbor. But when she returned to the valley after burying him in her kin's dirt 2 towns east, she didn't weep or plead for help. She started building. And she didn't build on the banks, where every other homesteader had already staked their claims in neat rows of log homes along the tree line. She didn't choose the foothills either, where the earth sloped up just enough to stay dry through the thaw. No, Alissa dragged her sled full of salvaged beams and river stones right onto the center of Larchmouth Lake, the same lake folks fished in, skated across, and warned their children to stay off after March. Mid-December, the ice was thick, 2 feet thick at least, enough to hold a horse team for a few hours, but nobody in their right mind would bet their home on it. Nobody but her. They watched her drag planks across the brittle ice in the mornings, her baby girl strapped to her back, wrapped in wool and silence. By noon she was hammering, sometimes with her coat off despite the wind. By sundown, there were already 4 corner posts driven deep into the ice like stakes into the flesh of a beast, and the neighbors started whispering harder. "She's mad. She'll drown that baby. She don't know the thaw comes early some years. She don't care. That's the thing, she ain't scared of God or ice or nothing." But Alissa wasn't reckless. She wasn't mad. She had been watching, listening. The logs were tight-packed, double-sealed with river mud, then overlaid with flat stones she warmed by fire before pressing them into seams. Her stove, an old iron barrel her husband had once used for maple sap boiling, she set dead center in the floor, right above a ring of heat-retaining granite she had sledded from the old creek to the west. She didn't dig a cellar, she didn't need to. Beneath her, the lake was the cellar. The food she packed into hollowed-out ice chambers stayed cool and dry without freezing solid. And her floor, raised 6 inches above the main ice sheet, supported by slabs that redistributed weight, designed not to trap heat downward but to radiate it slowly inward, keeping her child's feet warm even when the air outside hissed frost against the windows. When the roof went up, people stopped pretending they weren't watching. A group of men stood at the edge of the lake one afternoon, arms crossed and jokes ready, but she ignored them. One even shouted, "You plan to ride that cabin downstream when the thaw hits, missus?" No answer, just the sound of hammering. Another neighbor, a matronly woman named Ruth Lampsey, brought a pot of soup one afternoon and stood near the edge, coat buttoned to her throat, looking out in disbelief. "There's dry land, you know," she called gently. "Safer land. You could bring that baby to my place while you figure this out." Alissa stepped outside, sleeves rolled, hair wind-whipped. She didn't answer at first. She just looked at Ruth, then down at the baby in her arms, then at the lake. The sun was lowering behind the ridge, casting gold against the ice. "This is the only place the frost doesn't get in," she said finally, voice firm but calm. "The heat doesn't leave. The stone keeps it. The water holds it." Ruth didn't understand. Nobody did, not until the freeze worsened. By the 3rd week of January, the real storm hit. Not the kind that comes with snow and wind, but the kind that lingers long after the sky clears, a high-pressure freeze that sank through every wall and board like God's own breath holding everything still. Firewood didn't burn as long. Pipes froze even if they were buried. The river stopped running. Babies cried at night because their toes burned white, then numb. Neighbors huddled in beds, curled beside their dying fires, scraping frost from the inside of their cabin windows. Chickens froze. Dogs howled in the barns, then went silent. But out on the lake, something strange happened. Smoke still rose from the widow's chimney, tall and clean, not choking black like everyone else's. Her windows glowed orange each night, not flickering but steady. No snow clung to her eaves, no frost on the inside panes. By the fifth night of that terrible stretch, a man named Jacob Franks, whose wife hadn't slept in 3 days from worry over their coughing son, bundled up and stomped across the frozen yard, then further, boots cracking faintly over the frozen lake. He just wanted to ask what kind of stove she used, how she stacked her logs, why her home hadn't gone bitter cold like the rest. But as he approached, he paused halfway because heat hit him. Not a breeze, not fire, smoke. Heat, radiating faintly through the ice coming up from under her cabin. He felt it through his boots, a dry, strange warmth seeping outward. He turned around and left without knocking. By morning, word had spread. They said the widow's house was cooked. Said she must have hidden coal under the lake. Said she used river spirits or tricked some medicine man from the hills. They said anything but the truth, which was that she had used the only resource nobody else had thought to use. Not fire, not more wood, the lake itself. Because while the surface froze, the mass of water beneath held at a steady 32 degrees. And the way she built, with air gaps, stone mass, radiant floor heat and insulation pulled tight with oiled sheepskin, the warmth she fed into that home never left. The ice couldn't pull it downward. It floated back into the cabin, slow and quiet, like breath inside a womb. And the baby never coughed, never shivered. Some folks still laughed, but the laughs were thin now, forced, almost bitter. Ruth Lampsey watched from her own porch night after night, arms wrapped tight. She hadn't slept well in weeks. Her boy had frostbite on 2 fingers. Her husband was still chopping logs at midnight. And that orange glow from the cabin on the lake, it never dimmed. By the end of January, someone would knock on that door. By mid-February, more would follow. And before winter ended, the very people who mocked her would line up in the cold, teeth chattering, hands out, and learn that the strangest place to build a cabin was the warmest place to survive. But for now the ice held, the heat rose, and the widow waited. The first to knock was not a man, but a girl. A frostbitten morning had sunk its teeth into the valley, and across the lake, the trees stood like rows of sharpened spears. The sun hadn't touched their tips yet, and the silence was so pure that Alissa could hear the girl's feet crack the ice with every careful step. She was maybe 12, wrapped in a patched-up coat 2 sizes too big, boots stiff with frost. Her breath came hard as she reached the porch, and even before her fist touched the wood, Alissa had opened the door. The girl flinched at the warmth. It hit her like a tide, not blistering, not stifling, but full and solid, like a warm body waiting in a cold bed. She blinked, stepped back as if frightened, then met Alissa's eyes. "Mama sent me." Alissa didn't answer right away. She looked past the girl, squinting toward the ridge. "Ruth." The girl confirmed it with a nod. "Mama says she's sorry." Alissa stepped aside. The girl didn't hesitate. She walked in without being told, closed the door behind her with a breath that half whimpered, half collapsed. Inside, the cabin glowed with low firelight. The walls held heat the way thick wool holds a heartbeat, slow, steady, patient. The baby slept in a sling by the hearth, pink-cheeked, her breath like puffs of silk. The girl took off her mitts. Her fingers were red but not blue. Her eyes darted to the baby, then to the stove. "Mama says we got no more salt pork. Papa's trying to hunt, but his fingers won't grip right. He burned em on the stove door, couldn't feel it." Alissa said nothing. She bent by the hearth, lifted a flat stone from the warming ring. Beneath it, still cool but unfrozen, was a bundle of smoked trout, salted weeks ago, wrapped in birch bark and wool. She handed it to the girl without a word. The child took it like a starving creature handed meat for the first time in days. Her voice cracked. "Thank you." Alissa nodded. "Tell your mother to wrap her boy's fingers in bear fat. I'll send some tomorrow." That was all. But by dawn the next day, two more came, a couple from the southern edge of the valley. They didn't send a child. They came themselves, faces chapped, breath trembling. "We heard your cellar don't freeze," the man said. "It doesn't," Alisa replied, not as pride but fact. "We brought what we could trade." They showed her half a sack of frozen apples, a cracked tin of lard, and 2 rabbit pelts. Not much, but she took them and gave back a tin of ground barley, some dried greens, and a stone-warmed jar of bear grease. "Wrap your baby in wool before bed," she said. "Sleep with her feet against your belly. You'll both survive it." No names were exchanged, only goods and advice. But the silence around the widow began to thin. Within a week 7 more came. One was crying, one limped, another hadn't eaten since the previous morning. They were all drawn by the same thing, not charity, not warmth, but curiosity. How was she doing it? How was a single woman, with a baby, surviving in a house built on ice? They stared at the stones she'd packed into the cabin walls, hand-warmed, heat-soaked, radiating low comfort long after the fire dimmed. They stared at the floor gaps, the faint breath of warm air moving beneath the boards. They noticed how her chimney never smoked thick, how her door opened without frost cracking the seal. She let them look, but never for long, and she never let them forget it wasn't luck, it wasn't magic, it was choice. She chose the lake because she knew the ice would hold not forever but long enough. And the water below, it was a gift nobody else saw. "Cold air sinks," she told one neighbor, a schoolteacher whose brother had lost 2 fingers. "But water below ice never drops past a certain point. It holds heat better than earth, and the ice insulates the heat that rises." He blinked at her like she'd spoken another language. Maybe she had. But word kept spreading. By the 2nd week of February, a boy died in one of the cabins near the bluff. His mother found him stiff, curled into himself like a moth pressed between pages. That death cracked the pride of the valley. After that, people stopped pretending she didn't exist. They came with offerings, smoked meats, bark tea, cloth strips, broken tools. And Alisa, always silent, always steady, took what she needed, gave what she could, and never once said, "I told you so." But even as respect crept in, envy followed. One night someone threw a stone. It smashed her front window just after midnight. The cold hit hard. The baby woke. Alisa snatched her close, teeth clenched. She didn't chase the shadow she saw vanish beyond the tree line. She just sealed the window with oiled hide, lit a fresh fire, and rocked the child until her breathing calmed. The next morning she found footprints on the ice. Not just 1 pair, 3. Someone had watched her. Perhaps seen the barrels of dried goods beneath the cabin, packed neatly in cut ice chambers. Perhaps they wanted what she had, or maybe they were angry she had found a way no man had dared. That afternoon, she spent 6 hours reinforcing the door. She stacked river stones against the lower beams, filled the cracks with pine pitch. She tied a bell to the top hinge with copper wire, just enough to jingle if touched. She didn't sleep that night, she listened. The next knock came not with hands but hooves. A family from the far ridge had lost their roof in a windstorm. The father came on horseback, his wife behind him, their baby wrapped tight in a sling. Their eyes were hollow, their hands trembling. They didn't ask to come in. They asked to stay. Alisa hesitated. She debuilt for herself, for her child. She had enough barely, but 3 more mouths, that would stretch everything. And yet, she saw the woman's hands, blue at the edges. She saw the infant's face, still like a doll. She opened the door. They didn't speak for the first hour. They just sat, backs against the wall, thawing. And then the baby cried. A real cry, sharp, urgent, alive, and the mother wept. After that night, everything changed. Alisa didn't live alone anymore. They stayed on the floor, rolled in blankets. The man helped chop wood. The woman took turns feeding the stove when Alisa had to wash. They shared meals. They took shifts watching the lake. And people noticed. They noticed that the cabin wasn't just warm, it was alive. That it had become more than a home, it was a fortress, a lighthouse, a stubborn miracle standing on a sheet of ice refusing to crack. And then came the freeze that made the last one look mild. Winds blew in from the mountains, howling like wolves. Temperatures dropped below zero for 7 days straight. Firewood disappeared faster than it could be chopped. Water jugs froze indoors. Cabins along the ridge filled with smoke not from warmth but from desperation. Chimneys clogged, stoves cracked. A child went blind from snow glare. An old man lost 3 toes. But the widow's cabin, it stayed 30 degrees warmer. Because now the stone was layered. The floor doubled. The insulation tightened. And with each visitor, each trade, Alisa had gathered just enough to reinforce the heart of the home until it no longer fought the cold, it absorbed it, reshaped it, pressed it out. By the 3rd day of the deep freeze, 5 more people knocked. By the 5th day, a mother begged to come inside. And Alisa let them in one by one, until 9 souls shared the space meant for 2. They slept in shifts, they told stories low and soft, they cooked in silence, they cried without shame. And on the 7th night of the freeze, as winds clawed through the trees, and the sky pulsed with cold like bruised iron, the ice beneath the cabin groaned. A deep, thunderous groan. Everyone froze. They looked at Alisa. She didn't panic. She rose, wrapped her baby tight, stepped to the center of the room and pressed her ear to the floor. The groan came again, long, low, deep. The lake was shifting, but not cracking. She smiled. Just moving, she whispered. Ice don't break in silence, it screams when it goes. And she sat back down. No one slept that night. But the floor held, the heat stayed, and the baby didn't cry. The freeze didn't break all at once. It loosened like a hand unclenching, finger by finger. One day the trees stopped cracking. The next the birds returned to the sky, not in full voice but in cautious bursts. Snow still blanketed the valley, but the edges of it softened, no longer crusted with ice sharp enough to cut skin. But just because the cold began to ease didn't mean the damage hadn't been done. 3 cabins had collapsed under snow weight. 2 families had buried kin, one a newborn, the other a boy of 8 who'd wandered too far during a whiteout and hadn't been found until his tracks ended at the riverbank. Even the healthiest men now carried frost scars on their fingers and noses, and nobody chopped wood bare-handed anymore. And out in the center of the lake, the cabin still stood. The groan the ice had given a week before had become part of its rhythm, not a threat, but a presence. Every night it sang beneath them, like a long, whale-deep breath that reminded them they were sleeping not on land, but on a living thing. Alisa taught the others to listen for certain tones. A sharp crack meant shift. A hollow pulse meant weight change. But the one they feared never came, the sharp, brittle shriek of rupture. It never did. Word spread farther than the ridge. A mail courier came in from Dead Lick Pass one afternoon, his cheeks blistered raw and his horse half frozen. He brought letters for the township but lingered near the shore. When asked why he stared, he just muttered, didn't think the stories were real, said she lived out on the ice like a crow. He left with a parcel of dried trout and a warning, don't get too close come March. But March came and the thaw didn't. The cold had settled too deep. Spring retreated like a spooked animal, and even when the sun rose stronger each day, the wind off the mountains cut its efforts short. Still the settlers began repairs. Cracked roofs were patched, doors rehung, chickens coaxed out, babies carried in tighter wraps. Life resumed not joyfully but with the stubborn, silent rhythm of survival. But something had changed. They no longer looked at the cabin on the lake with mockery. They looked at it with longing. They saw it glow at dusk, soft firelight flickering through oiled hide windows, and wondered what it felt like to live inside something that had won. And some of them, those with less pride or more wounds, came again, not for food, not for warmth, but for advice. How'd you keep the drafts out? What's that paste you use between the planks? Is that sheep wool in the walls? Where'd you learn to shape stone like that? Alisa answered in short replies, not out of coldness but clarity. She didn't hoard knowledge, but she didn't waste breath either. Those who listened carefully learned more in 10 minutes than they had in 10 years. She told them that rocks retain heat better than wood, that the ice below never dropped below freezing, which made it more stable in deep cold than the air, that cooking low and slow, not in a roaring blaze but with insulated coals, warmed the bones of a cabin, not just its breath. And that was how the second cabin began. Not hers but another. A widow named Nora Blythe, whose son had nearly lost both ears during the January freeze, began dragging stone out onto the lake edge. Not far, not to the center, but just enough. She didn't build the whole cabin there, just a storage shed, just something to try it. People mocked her too, but not as loud this time. They still remembered how quiet Alisa had been when they laughed, and how that silence became proof. Nora built slow. She checked with Alisa twice, once about the stones, once about the floorboards. Each time Alisa nodded, said little. When Nora finished her shed, she found it kept her meat dry, her herbs soft, her cider from freezing solid. And behind her, small, stiff, shivering but alive, walked Milla Gorvin. The girl had fallen into a snow pocket near the southern edge of the lake and curled up, waiting to die. But Alisa knew the ice in that area groaned differently. It bent in long cycles. Sound moved through it like whispers in a tunnel. She followed that groan like a hound follows scent. And she'd found the girl. After that, they stopped calling her the widow, stopped calling her the woman on the lake. They called her Denholm. No title, just a name, like a stone, quiet, heavy, real. By March, 5 new cabins had begun construction for the next winter, each on reinforced ice platforms. One would use heat vents beneath its floor. Another would be built atop split-rail pontoons layered in oiled wool. All were inspired by hers. She helped all 5. She said little, nodded when asked, spoke when it mattered, never offered what wasn't earned. But sometimes, late at night, she walked the edge of the lake with her daughter in her arms, now nearly 3, strong-legged, curious-eyed. The girl never cried from cold. She'd never known true frost. One night, Ruth joined her walk. "Do you ever miss it?" Ruth asked. "The quiet, the solitude." Alisa shook her head. "It's still quiet." Ruth smiled. "You made something they can't ignore. That must feel strange." "It doesn't feel like anything," Alisa said. "It just works." They stood on the shore, looking at the now famous cabin, the first raft house, still warm, still holding. "You know," Ruth said, "they'll write about this someday. The woman who built her home on ice. They'll say it was genius, say you were a prophet." "I don't want that," Alisa said. "What do you want?" She looked at her daughter, who blinked back, nose pink. "I want her to grow up in a place where nobody laughs first." The snow began to fall again, gentle this time. Not a storm, just a hush. And from the center of the lake, the cabin glowed, same as always, warm against the white. Spring returned quietly that 4th year, not in a burst, not in any grand, showy way. It crept in like an apology. The ice softened at the edges of Larchmouth Lake with more patience this time, and the trees opened their buds without urgency, as though unsure if they were allowed to trust the thaw. The sun was warmer, yes, and the winds less cruel, but there was still something cautious about the way the valley turned green again. And this time, when the lake melted, the people were ready. 6 cabins floated now. Not all of them were perfectly designed. One tilted slightly. Another drifted 6 inches after an anchor post snapped loose, but they floated, and more importantly, they had survived. They had survived the worst winter in a decade, a whiteout storm that had nearly buried the ridgeline, and temperatures that had killed entire herds of livestock one valley over. Every single one of the raft cabins had held firm, and the original den homes stood at their center, steady as a lighthouse. Folks had stopped talking about her with awe alone. Now they used her name like a verb. You need to den home those walls tighter. That's not how she stones the base. She does it in double rows. If you're not radiating heat from the floor, it ain't den home built. Alisa didn't correct them. She let it happen. She had no desire to be worshipped, only understood. And now, finally, they did. Even Emery Slate, the proud, bitter man who once called her a lake witch, had begun sketching a design for a raised winter storehouse on pontoons. He'd never said sorry to her face again after that day in Ruth's cabin, but one afternoon he brought over a set of homemade copper hooks and left them on her porch with a folded note that simply read, "To hang your baby's winter coat, they'll last longer than nails. E." Alisa hung the coat the next morning. Her daughter Miriam, now 3.5, had begun speaking in full sentences. She told the other children that their house bounced like a duck, and she liked how the floor hummed in storms. She'd never known fear in winter, not the way her mother had. And to Alisa, that was worth more than any respect the town could offer. But not everyone was content. The township council, 3 older men and 1 widow who rarely spoke, called a meeting in early April to discuss a transition plan for cabin standards. Alisa didn't attend. She knew what it meant. The raft cabins had embarrassed them. Their rigid codes, their warnings, their early resistance to innovation, all of it now looked like failure. They wanted to formalize the very thing they had once forbidden. So be it. She didn't need their approval. She built a second raft, not a cabin this time, but a classroom. By mid-May, a low, wide platform sat beside her home on the lake, connected by a rope bridge no wider than a cart plank. It held a stone-lined hearth at the center, benches fashioned from birch slats, and a blackened slate board mounted between 2 upright timbers. It was not for teaching letters. It was for teaching heat. Alisa, now 37, kept building. Not homes always, but systems. Smoke towers, wind catchers, draft blockers built from ash and waxed hide. She developed insulation sleeves for boots, created a trench-lining design that funneled cold air away from shelters, and even figured out how to dry snow-dampened wood with fireless heat using reflective stone cones. No one called her a witch anymore. They called her a mother of heat. That spring, a writer from 2 Point Junction came asking for a story. "I heard you built the first floating homestead in this territory," he said. "They say you predicted the freeze." Alisa was mending a cracked floorboard. She didn't look up. "I didn't predict anything, I listened." "To what?" She tapped the plank. "The lake." He frowned, scribbling. "I'm not sure readers will understand that." She shrugged. "They don't need to." He closed his notebook slowly. "You've saved a lot of lives. Do you want credit?" "I want my daughter to never be cold." That was the end of the interview. He published it anyway, called her the heat architect, said her design saved a township, printed a sketch of her cabin that looked nothing like the real thing, too grand, too symmetrical, too romantic, but people liked the story. And when people came, settlers from 3 valleys over, they brought questions. Alisa gave them the same as she gave everyone else, her hands, her eyes, her silence until the right moment to speak. And then the truth, always. The truth that heat isn't made, it's kept. That survival is not force, it's design. That the world is cold, but not unfair if you know how to listen. That year, 38 new cabins were built. 12 on water. And every one of them had a space beneath the hearth for stone, a pocket in the floor for ice-banked stores, and a venting channel lined with clay. They used resin, bark, oilcloth, and copper wire. They didn't all succeed perfectly, but they knew why when they failed. And that made all the difference. When Miriam turned 6, she asked her mother, "Did Papa ever see this cabin?" Alyssa sat quiet a long time before answering. "No," she said softly, "but I think he'd feel proud of it." Miriam nodded, then added, "I think he built part of it too, even if he didn't know it." Alyssa kissed her daughter's forehead. "He did, baby, he did." That night the wind came from the east, soft but steady. The lake didn't groan, it sang. A deep, slow hum that echoed beneath the platform, into the stones, through the hearth, and up into the ceiling beams. Miriam didn't stir in her sleep. The cabin stayed 30 degrees warmer than the world outside. And in the dark, Alyssa stood at the door, hand against the wood, and listened one more time. Not for danger, not for threat, but for rhythm. The rhythm of ice that held. The rhythm of warmth that stayed. The rhythm of a home that had once been a joke. Until it saved an entire town.